Interview with Peter Thiel, co-founder of the online payment service PayPal. This 45-minute event began with comments from the editor of the National Review, Rich Lowry.
Very rare where I get an opportunity to wield a gavel, so I'm going to do it a couple more times. John Boehner better watch out here. I just want to first of all thank all of you for being here, and not just because it's 8:10 on Saturday morning, but because this election was a real blow. Abraham Lincoln, when he was elected in 1860, he went on this great procession to Washington with all these campaign-style stops on his way there. And on one of these stops, he met a very enthusiastic supporter who just went on and on. Mr. Lincoln, you mean so much to me. I'll do anything for you. I'll give my life for you. And to kind of calm him down a little bit, he told a little anecdote that went something like this. A young man in Illinois signed up for the militia to go fight the Indians. And the day he was going to leave, his sisters were so excited that he was going off to war, they created this belt buckle for him that they emblazoned with the words, "Victory or Death." And he saw this and read it, blanched a little bit, and told his sisters, well, why don't we change it to "Victory or Hurt Pretty Bad?" And this election hurt pretty bad. And I think all of us at some level felt an impulse to quit, to want to give up and just go and lick our wounds. And if anyone had any doubts about the folly of that impulse, I hope they've been blown away by the last week, where we had the second inaugural, and then also, not as historic, but in its way almost as telling, this remark from this White House aide, Dan Pfeiffer, who said, "We do not have a political system that is worthy of this moment in our history." And I guess it's never occurred to him that perhaps the problem is that we have leaders who are not worthy of our political system. And I think really what they want us to do, in the bottom of their hearts, they want us to go away, curl up, and die. And one of the points of this event and events like this by the conservative movement in coming months will be that will never, ever happen. We should be inspired by the immortal battlefield report of the French general Ferdinand Foch, who said, "I'm hard-pressed on my right, my center is yielding, impossible to maneuver, situation excellent, I attack." And I think as a movement, there are two, just speaking in the broadest possible terms, there are two things that we have to do, and two things that will be reflected in the rest of this weekend. One, we need to reaffirm our essential truths. No matter how unpopular they seem, no matter how pointless it seems to continue to reaffirm them. Bill Buckley captured this imperative very eloquently back in what must have been a low moment for our movement in our country. He wrote a letter to Henry Kissinger that went in part, "We must do what we can to bring hammer blows against the bell jar that protects the dreamers from reality, so that pounding from without, we can effect resonances which will one day crack through to the latent impulses of those who dream within, bringing to life a circuit that will spare the Republic." At National Review, we have been hammering on that bell jar for more than 55 years and will continue to do it as long as our doors are open. The second imperative, though, is we need to be willing to question our own received wisdom. We need to be willing to look reality in the eye and acknowledge it as it is, and we have to be willing to adjust how our timeless principles get expressed in practical politics and practical policies, because it's not the 1980s again, and it never will be the 1980s again. And if Ronald Reagan were here with us today, he would not be advocating exactly the same policies as he did 30 or 40 years ago. So we need to question our assumptions as well as reaffirming our timeless principles. And to this latter end, I think there's no better way to start the day than to hear from our next guest, Peter Thiel. As a sign of his business acumen and his keen insight into human nature and how the world works, Years before the rest of us, he realized that what most of the world would want to do online would be to post pictures of themselves drunk and to pretend to their friends that their lives are cooler and more interesting than they really are. Thus, he became the original outside investor in Facebook. He's played in the movie The Social Network by an actor named Wallace Langman. He's the co-founder of PayPal. He established the Thiel Fellowships to encourage bright young people to quit college and do something productive with their lives and found new businesses. He's one of the most innovative thinkers on the free market right, and he's going to talk to us a bit this morning about whether our deepest held assumptions about technological progress in this country hold true or not. So please join me in welcoming Peter Thiel. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you very much. As we reflect today about these questions about the future, I'm reminded of a conversation I had years ago with a friend of mine who was a one-time math professor in his early 70s. We're talking about whether he believed in life after death, and he said he had really no idea. But he desperately hoped that there was no life after death because he didn't want to see his ex-wife again. And I think in some ways that sort of captures much of the mood in the United States about the future. We have no idea what's going to happen next in the years and decades ahead, although we have some sort of a sense that all the paths forward are not going quite the right way. And as a way to sort of frame this discussion about technology and science, and which I think is one of the key areas where there has been an extraordinary and under-discussed failure. It's worth reflecting how different our expectations about the future would have been had we been gathered here 40 years ago or 45 years ago in the late 60s, early 70s. If you had asked people to do a bet on whether in the next 40 years we would send someone to Mars, send a man to Mars, or whether a black person would get elected president of the United States, you would have gotten 10-to-1 odds on Mars. Maybe 100-to-1, but at least 10-to-1. And I don't want to talk today about all the ways in which there's been a social and cultural change in the U.S. I want to talk about the things that have not changed and the way in which in almost every area of scientific and technological progress, with the one very important exception of computers that I will also come back to, we have radically fallen short of the great expectations that we had in the past. To take the most narrow, literal version, we are no longer moving faster. And this has been one of the main ways in which progress was measured for decades and centuries. Faster sailboats, faster railroads in the 19th century, faster cars, faster planes. It culminated with the Concorde in 1976. It was decommissioned in 2003. And today we're probably back to about 1960-era travel speeds when you include the very low-tech airport security systems that we have in place. This failure of if you can just sort of recall, they promised us flying cars in the 1960s. We sort of got 140 characters on Twitter or something like that instead. The failure, I think, in transportation reflects an extraordinary failure in energy innovation and in the way in which energy prices have relentlessly moved higher over the last number of decades. The U.S. has never fully recovered from the oil shock of the 1970s. Real energy prices today are probably comparable to where they were in the early, in the worst part of the Carter era of the late 70s. The nuclear industry, has been dead for decades. It would probably be criminal to encourage an undergraduate to study nuclear engineering today. And of course, in Silicon Valley, all the sort of promised alternatives like clean tech have become really just toxic a toxic word for ways to lose money rather badly. And I think this failure in energy innovation probably has extended to almost all these sort of commodity goods which people thought of as a major area of progress. There was a very famous bet in 1980 between the free market economist Julian Simon and the ecologist Paul Ehrlich. Simon said, a basket of commodities would go down in price over the course of the next decade. Ehrlich said they would go up. Simon was right in the 80s. He famously won the bet. But if you were to look at that bet again, from 1993 onward, every single decade, 93 to 03, 94 to 04, Ehrlich has been winning that bet. And I think that's sort of a strange commentary on what has gone wrong. Food prices have escalated. The green revolution of the 50s and 60s of agricultural innovation has sort of stalled out very badly. And so that, I think that much of the Arab Spring can be interpreted not as some great victory for democracy, but as sort of the immediate byproduct of desperate people who became more hungry than scared as a result of immensely escalating food prices in recent decades. Medical innovation is another area where things seem very badly stalled out. There may be 1/3 as many drugs going through the FDA process as there were 20 years ago. And our expectations about the future have also correspondingly been diminished. I think in 1970, the U.S. Nixon administration famously declared war on cancer. It was going to be defeated by the bicentennial 6 years later. 43 years have passed. We are, in some sense, 43 years closer to the goal by definition, but there is a sense that it's further than 6 years away. And if you were to say, ask for a crusade against Alzheimer's, which probably afflicts somewhere between a third and a half of Americans aged 85 and older, this would not even sort of gain attention. So there's been 40 years of slack and failure in area after area that we look at to the point where even our expectations have been radically reduced for what can possibly be done going forward. I think it's a very important question why this deceleration has taken place. There sort of is one type of argument that all the easy ideas were discovered, that it sort of is natural, we somehow ran out of ideas. And I think the other version, which I'm more sympathetic to, is that it is somehow cultural and that we've stopped trying, or we thought it wasn't a good thing to pursue these things anymore. And that in many ways there's been incredible regulation of innovation and that sort of the areas that were very heavily regulated basically stalled out. And everything from aerospace to biotechnology to nuclear power to all these other industries have essentially been regulated to death. And we can see this with the exceptions, the areas that were relatively lightly regulated. The least regulated industry in the U.S. was the computer industry, and that has seen 40 years of tremendous progress. But I think, I think that it's easy to sort of turn these computer companies into scapegoats because they obviously haven't quite delivered the goods. But I think in terms of our whole economy, but I think it's also partially that it's not enough, and computers alone can't do everything. And we have a sort of world where we've been allowed and we've had freedom to do things in the world of bits, but we've had no freedom to do things in the world of stuff. Maybe you can sort of interpret it as a kind of environmentalism where you're allowed to manipulate a virtual world of information, but anytime you do things with the real material world, that's illegal, that's sacred, that can't be touched at all. And the problem in some sense is that this sort of Cartesian dualism, where we're able to do things in a virtual world but not in the real world, ends up being economically quite having only some limited value. And so you can send pictures of cats to friends halfway around the world, or you can, on your iPad, you can watch a cartoon version of the Jetsons while riding a 19th century subway system that's falling apart in New York City. And there's some value in being able to do this, but it doesn't quite translate economically. And I think the sort of the big economic data point that I always cite in this is that if we look at 40-year intervals, 1933 to 1973, 73 to 2013, 33 to 73, average incomes in the U.S. went up 350% after inflation. 73 to 2013, they went up 22%. And this sort of, and there are all sorts of caveats to this, but even when you add all of them in, it doesn't change sort of the basic reality that there's been this incredible deceleration and this incredible sense of stagnation that has resulted, where we have essentially outlawed and banned massive areas of technology from what we can do in our society. It's sort of the one way I've described it is that I think it somehow happened in the 1970s. And that this is, of course, the decade that liberals never really like to talk about. They always like talking about the 80s, and that's when things sort of went wrong. But things really went wrong in the 1970s, and that's when we really had this radical separation between the world of information and the world of stuff. Perhaps there are iconic things you can point to. So we landed on the moon in July of 1969. 3 weeks later, Woodstock began. And that was perhaps the point at which the hippies more or less took over the country, and the genuine cultural war over progress was lost. Or perhaps the most important place where the real and the virtual were separated was on the currency level, where in August of 1971 we went off the gold standard. And while you might describe it as a barbaric relic, it did have a sort of way of anchoring money into the real world and the real economy. And when you radically separated them, you can have all these ways you can print money, manipulate it, and things like that. But the problem is there are limits to what you can buy with it. You can buy, in San Francisco where I live, you can buy old Victorian houses, but you can't buy anything new. It's illegal to basically manipulate things and build new things. This is parenthetically not just a problem in technological innovation, it's also a problem in many other areas. Empire State Building in New York City was built in 15 months in 1931-32. World Trade Center is taking 10 years and counting to rebuild. The Golden Gate Bridge was built in 3 years in the 1930s. At this point, there's a Nancy Pelosi-funded access road that's costing 7 years, and more in real dollars than the original bridge to build. And so, and this is sort of a problem that we see in many of these areas across the board. I think that what this sort of technological deceleration perspective leads me to think is that the most important policy area on the economic side that we need to reform is all the microeconomic stuff. We need to enable people to actually do things again. And it's not fundamentally about macroeconomic policies, how much money we print or how little we print. I think there's some mistakes being made there, but I think the real issue is not to let this virtual world be confused with the real world. And I think it suggests, a number of, it helps explain a number of the strange things that have happened in this country over recent decades and gives us a somewhat different perspective on what is going on today. And in the brief time I have, I just want to mention 3 areas where it suggests a somewhat different perspective on things. One of the strange economic phenomena in the U.S. and indeed, the entire developed world has been this series of extraordinary bubbles that we've had in recent decades. It's really historically unprecedented. There was a crazy bubble in the 1720s and the 1920s. There had been basically 2 in the 300-year history of the modern world, and we've had 4 or 5 in just the last quarter century. There was one in Japan in the 80s. There was the tech bubble in the U.S. in the 90s. There was a housing finance bubble in the 2000s. And we probably have an even crazier government bubble that's getting started and really getting inflated even as we speak today, not just in the U.S., but also all other developed countries. And these bubbles happen because people have great expectations of progress that they've been told. And these expectations are no longer tenable in a world of fundamentally slowed innovation. And so it is a credit crisis and a technology crisis have this in common, that they both involve, they're both based on a future that doesn't live up to the past expectations. I will pay you $1 on Tuesday for a hamburger today. It works if you earn $1 on Tuesday. You can buy a house and pay it off if everything gets better over time. If it does not, you're likely to have quite a big crisis. And as we, I know there's a lot of cause for pessimism, but one optimistic thread in this is that there's absolutely nothing in my mind, very little, I should say, very little that can be read into the election in 2012, just as I think there was not too much one should have read into Clinton's re-election in '96 or Bush's re-election in '04. They happened because of bubbles. We had a tech bubble that helped Clinton get reelected. We had a housing bubble that helped Bush get reelected. And we have a $1 trillion borrowing bubble that helped the current president get reelected. And these bubbles will end. And when they end, you will end up with a completely different perspective on things. So I think we should figure out what a world looks like where you don't have bubbles fueling things and how we make such a world non-catastrophic. But as a very basic starting point, we have to realize that we're in a bubble that's crazier, bigger than any of the ones we've had in the past. It's like, and it's probably, there's something about it that's fundamentally very, very unsustainable. And so I think that is sort of the silver lining from a tactical, partisan perspective that we have to have on the situation. I think one of the challenges, however, in a stagnant world for Republicans is that it is a big problem for the core constituencies of the Republican Party. I think the famous Carol Quigley line that the Republicans are the party of the middle class and the Democrats are the party of everyone else is still as true today as when he wrote it in the early 60s. And if you define the American middle class and upper middle class as the people who have a dream of a always better and improving future, that's actually very different from the expectations of people who are desperately poor and think things will never change, or perhaps the super rich. And so we have a world where most of the millionaires are Republicans and most of the billionaires are Democrats. And this is sort of an issue we need to think about very clearly. And in a stagnant world, you have to, there's going to be political pressure to get rid of what the Republican Party represents and to get rid of the middle and upper middle class. You can have a stagnant world with a few rich people and many desperately poor people. You cannot have a broad group of people that expects to do better and better year after year after year. And I think that, while I don't have time for this today, I suspect that every single one of the current administration's policies involves transfers away from the middle and upper middle class, but not primarily to the poor. They're officially to the poor, but they're primarily towards the super wealthy, non-Republican people in this country. And that would be sort of a very interesting theme to explore at some length. The third theme that this technological slowdown stagnation thesis suggests is it does give us a very different perspective on the current administration. I know conservatives often like to describe it as socialist or communist, but I think this is somehow very, very wrong when you look at the world through the prism of technological and scientific progress. Karl Marx was optimistic, deterministic, and concerned about, fundamentally concerned about the real world. And the current administration is fundamentally pessimistic, indeterminate, and concerned about great abstractions. And while I realize this may not be the right place to say this, it may sound like but I find the original Marx considerably more appealing than the current counterfeit version. And I think that if you want to have a critique of the current administration, you could perhaps begin with Marx, Engels, Lenin. What would they have actually said? Lenin, where is your 5-year plan? If you're going to have such a big government, how are you measuring what it's doing? How much are they doing? I mean, socialism only works with a 5-year plan. You can't have socialism without a 5-year plan. That's just a complete racket. I know that the numbers by the Brezhnev era got screwed up, but we initially at least started to have 5-year plans in which we could measure our progress. Or drilling down on specifics on something like energy. The 5-year plan in the 1920s was rural electrification of the Soviet Union. So you at least had concrete specifics that you could be measured against whether they succeeded or failed. Whereas today, it is not a specific energy policy. It is an abstract portfolio, 100 different universities experimenting with different kinds of things. Nobody knows what's going to work or what's not going to work. Every failure is excused through portfolio theory, and nobody has an idea of what might work instead. And for that matter, I would say the Republican critique also tends to be not very scientific or technological. You take something like Solyndra. You can look at a cylindrically shaped solar panel and say it has 1/pi the efficiency of a flat solar panel. That's basically high school geometry. And you can just look at the shape of it and say it could have never worked. But that kind of argument does not even come close to resonating in a world that's simply no longer interested in science or technology. And of course, Engels would have said something like, dialectical materialism is fundamentally about progress. It's about never-ending progress. And what would he have said of a world where a so-called progressive has dropped the word progress and substituted the word change for the word progress? And is not the substitution of the word change for the word progress a sort of massive decline? Because it means that you no longer can measure things, you no longer think that there is an alpha and an omega to the liberal history of the world. And I think that if you want sort of the label for this, I think you could perhaps go to Karl Marx's PhD thesis from the mid-19th century, which was on Epicureanism, which I think was the specter that always haunted Marx. It was that the workers would no longer want to work. They would want to have a work-life balance. They'd want to spend all their time playing golf or doing various things like that. They would no longer believe that it made sense to have a revolution or even to work. And in some ways, I think that is sort of this sort of pessimistic Epicureanism is really the ethos of a stagnant society where people no longer think it makes sense to work towards a better future. I was talking to one of my investors in PayPal years ago. We were talking about his kids, and I asked him, "Do you think your kids will be better off than you?" And he said, "Absolutely no. I don't even have any hope of that. I only hope they will be happy." And I think that is sort of this very widespread pessimistic zeitgeist that we have to somehow overcome. Now, the problem with a Cartesian economy or an Epicurean philosophy is that that's not really the end point. And the end point of a world where there is incredible stagnation is that you end up with the specter of Malthus coming back, the specter of scarcity coming back in all these different forms. And I think the disturbing truth in my mind is that we are confronted with a number of Malthusian situations as a result of this lack of innovation. It is, and it is, of course, very, very hidden. So, in the U.S. we have fiat money that pays for fake food, which, and people are probably nutritionally pretty undernourished, but it sort of manifests itself in a diet of corn syrup and an explosion of obesity. And you have this in sort of many other contexts. And I think the attitude that we must have as libertarians and conservatives is not, like the current administration, to accept the decline and not to be in denial about the decline. These are not the only two modes of reasoning. It's not acceptance or denial, but I would suggest that we should try to fight it and that America should not go gently into that good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm just going to ask you a couple questions before we go on to our next guest. First of all, you win the prize for the most cutting criticism of Barack Obama this weekend, far and away. He's not worthy of Karl Marx. let me just ask you, first of all, on this idea of the technological stagnation. I can see someone from the right and someone from the left making two critiques of that. Person from the right, perhaps Harold Hamm, who we're going to hear from later this morning, will say, what are you talking about, technological slowdown? We've had this amazing advance in fracking, which is revolutionizing our energy economy. And then you would have someone from the White House saying, what are you talking about? We lack innovation. We are subsidizing a bunch of windmills and making a glorious leap into the green energy future. So what would your response be to those critiques?
Well, I think let me deal with the first one and not the second one. I think I'm very much in favor of the shale oil revolution, the fracking revolution. I think it is necessary for us to do this, in large part because the alternative energy has failed across the board on every level. So because I think the second one is not working, we desperately need to continue to push conventional energy in all its forms. The pessimistic view on fracking is that it will be outlawed by environmental regulation. I think that's a very real possibility, as so much other forms of innovation have been outlawed, and it can be outlawed on many levels. You know, it's not necessarily just on a state level that you don't let people do it, but you have to actually build the pipelines to send the oil. So there are all these logistical things you have to make sure that actually work. But I think you can be moderately optimistic on it and say that it represents, you know, a major improvement without actually solving my problem about absolute technological innovation. And the absolute question is whether we are doing more for less and whether things are getting absolutely cheaper. This is the Julian Simon versus Paul Ehrlich bet. So will fracking get oil prices back down to $1 a gallon or $1.50 a gallon? And I think that even most of its proponents suggest that it will still keep prices in the range of $60 to $100 a barrel, which is higher than they were. So it is actually less good than conventional energy was in the 50s and 60s, even though it is a desperate, necessary thing we do. So I think the alternative fracking is an absolute crisis where oil goes to $7, $8 a gallon or higher. We should definitely do it, but we should not, it doesn't necessarily translate into an absolute improvement in living standards. It's just something that stops them from going down faster.
Now, I know you said this could be a whole new chapter, hour-long speech on its own, but I want to push you a little bit and maybe get you to explain a little bit more the contention that the Obama administration's policies are fundamentally about transferring from the middle and the upper middle to the top. Because we just had this huge tax debate that was all about taxing people more at the top. So certainly folks at the left would reject that notion categorically, and even some folks on the right might scratch their heads over it.
Yes, well, it seems that, I'm not sure, you have to ask whether someone like Warren Buffett is not an economic actor. So that would be sort of the ad hominem version of this. But I think you can look at all of the different policies. I'll just take one. Take something like Obamacare. It is officially, it's clearly bad for people in the middle and upper middle class. And we can define someone in the middle class here as someone who has a job that provides health care insurance. And you get a sense that's going to be worse. It is probably good for some people who have no health insurance whatsoever, so there is some transfer to the poor. But what I suspect actually is going to happen with it in the years ahead is that companies will use it as an excuse to dump their employees onto the inferior government-funded program, and then other companies will follow suit because they have to compete with the companies that have dumped, and it will have the effect of dramatically increasing deficits in D.C., which is hard to believe, but I think the default is that it will lead to even higher deficit spending, and we will go from $1 trillion to $1 trillion plus, a la the Paul Krugman recommendation. The Krugman recommendation will actually be implemented. But it will at least temporarily boost profit margins for large companies because they will get rid of this one very large cost item. And the equity holders in these companies will do correspondingly better. And this is, of course, I think, politically why Obamacare will be so hard to reverse, because once the companies have dumped all their employees onto the government, it's not really clear how you get them to reassume it. And so you have to think of a lot of these policies as this sort of pincer movement of the upper class and the very poor against the center. And we could talk about tort lawyers, we could talk about urban slumlords. I mean, you could go on and on down the list, but I'll just use Obamacare as a starting point.
Now, Peter, you're a libertarian. In what ways do you think the Republican Party needs to become more libertarian?
Well, I think that, I think that we need to, I think that in a way, a libertarian perspective on the world is not just a timeless truth, but there is a way in which it is more true today than it has been in past decades. And it is more true because it is actually somehow closer to this reality of stagnation. It is actually somewhat more pessimistic than conservatism. And I think, and while I don't, and so I think we have to have sort of a more nuanced a view on how optimistic or pessimistic we are. We should be personally optimistic, we should be trying to make things better, but we should be somewhat more pessimistic about what can be done. And so the incredible optimism of a Jack Kemp, who believed you could have, spending increases and tax cuts, I think will give way to sort of the pessimism of a Ron Paul, who believes that money must be either hard or fake. And I think that sort of many of these areas are probably linked to pessimism in one form or another. I'm in favor of a less strict war on drugs, for example, but I think it also reflects a certain pessimism about our society that we should acknowledge. So, marijuana legalization is being driven by the failure of the war on cancer. If we had an actual cure on cancer, there would be a lot less pressure to legalize things. Or if you go back to something like prohibition in the 1920s, it was maybe a misguided policy, but it was also an expression of extreme optimism. People should not get drunk because they had so much productive work to do the next day. And so I think libertarianism is probably the pessimistic thread within the Republican Party. It's pessimistic about government action. It's somewhat pessimistic about foreign wars. It's pessimistic about a number of these interventions. And I think that is closest to the political reality of getting to 51%. And at the same time, we have to somehow not let the pessimism consume us, and we have to keep working on finding cures to cancer and solving these very real problems. Although I don't think we will have the government do that.
Peter, should those of us on the right care about the rise of income inequality?
Well, I think we should start by trying to diagnose it correctly. And I think that a lot of it is being driven by misguided government policies rather than by the right, and that would be sort of a starting point. There probably is. It is a bigger problem in a stagnant world than in a non-stagnant world, and so I do think that if we could fundamentally grow the pie, that would solve it. I suspect it is the same sets of government policies that are preventing us from really growing the economy that are also driving the rise in inequality. So I think they are one and the same. But we need to think really hard why it's happening. So, for example, there's a case to be made that the really wealthy people in the world today are not so much Americans, but they are people in emerging market countries that have captured enormous profits from the commodity fortune. So that the Russian oligarchs, there are sheikhs in the Middle East, there are people like this. And if you wanted to lessen the sort of global income inequality, and it's a global trend we're talking about, it's not a U.S. trend, you have to actually solve something like the energy problem and really get prices down.
And so perhaps that answers my next question, and you touched on it in your speech, but maybe you can explain a little bit more. If you were President of the United States right now, and you had a Peter Thiel majority in both the Senate and the House, and there are 2 or 3 policies that you could pass that would really tend to make this a non-stagnant economy again, what would they be?
Well, I think you would try to try to heavily deregulate the energy industry. You'd get rid of the FDA, and maybe you would try to do something to limit all the crazy zoning laws that prevent people from doing anything at all. But it's always a fictional question, because whenever you ask if you were president, it's ambiguous between if you were a dictator and if you had to go around kissing babies nonstop.
I'm not inviting you to run.
In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there often is.
Now, in the 19th century, we had this extraordinary period of technological progress. There was an enormous government element to it. You had the government building turnpikes and canals and subsidizing railroads and implementing a tariff that allowed American industry to have free space to grow and allowed us to develop an internal market. So again, Barack Obama, if you're listening to you today, might say, well, I'm just as innovative as you are, Peter, but I take on the lesson of Abraham Lincoln and others in the 19th century, and I realize all the ways that government can help create innovation and help create a better market.
Well, we can always debate the exact details of what happened in history, and those are very important. There certainly are cases where government action has helped. You could cite Apollo, you can cite the Manhattan Project, but one gets the sense these things would not happen today. A letter from Einstein to the White House probably would get lost in the mailroom. People would say, who was this crackpot physicist who had ideas that nobody else has? And I think we have a certain egalitarianism in science which cuts against people having specific ideas. It all gets funded on a peer-reviewed basis. It all is very, very incremental. We have probably about 100 times as many government-supported scientists as we had scientists in 1920. The absolute rate of innovation is less on a per-scientist basis. It's probably less than 1% of what it was in the 20s. So there is something about the productivity that is very, very low. At a minimum, I think you cannot have a government effort in science and technology if people don't understand it. So if they don't understand that Solyndra does not work because it's 1 over pi, as efficient as a flat solar panel, because a cylinder has a 2 pi r circumference versus 2r. Or, if you have, of the 535 people in Congress, generously 35 have a background in engineering, science, technology. The rest do not understand that windmills don't work when the wind is not blowing, or that solar power does not work at night. So the minimum condition is that you have sort of a comprehensive change in the people in the government before you could do that.
Tell us a little bit about the Thiel fellowships and the basic idea behind them.
Well, I sort of stumbled on this idea inadvertently. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. I was thinking that one of the big nonprofit things that I'd want to do would be to start a new university and do things the right way. There's a lot of higher education's kind of screwed up. One of my friends likes to describe the universities as the atheist church. It's sort of, but with much less diversity than the Catholic Church has. There was a thought of trying to do something new, and some of the people at my foundation spent a year, and we looked at every university that had been started in the Western world in the last 100 years. And it was a very sorry story of donor intent being screwed up, things not quite working, things not getting traction. There were a small number of exceptions, but by and large, nothing had worked. And I sort of started to think that, maybe there was actually too much effort inside universities. Maybe it was, I know there's always sort of a conservative effort to take over the universities, to get conservatives to go into grad school and somehow sneak in and join the faculties, but maybe that's actually immoral, and maybe we should actually encourage conservative professors to leave and not waste their lives and sacrifice themselves, and the same for conservative graduate students and conservative undergraduates, and maybe everybody else too while we're at it. And so we started looking at doing a very modest program of identifying 20 talented people, encouraging to stop out of school for a few years and do something else. But I do think we are in an education bubble today that's as crazy as the housing or finance bubble of the last decades. It is, of course, indeterminate. People don't actually know what they're learning, what it's being applied for in the most case. It's relentlessly more and more expensive, and basically, debt is one of the ways in which people historically became indentured servants, and that's sort of what effectively is happening with $1 trillion in student loans, which, to a first approximation, I believe, have gone to pay for $1 trillion of lies about the quality of the education they've received, and there's a lot more one can say about it, but I think we are at a point where it's really fraying pretty badly, and I think the Great Recession of the last few years, where the kids are moving back home with the parents, suggests that something's not quite working. And over the next few years, I think it is going to be subject to some sort of disruption that we don't quite know what yet.
Well, Peter, thank you for one of the most upliftingly despairing mornings I've ever encountered. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
All right,